Good day, ajmahari here. And let me just, before I begin, ask that if you find content from this channel helpful and you haven't subscribed yet, could you please subscribe and help the channel maybe to get found a little more in the algorithm? And so I did this short yesterday, and it was called BPD Empathy, ? Conscience, ? I have right now a comment from someone who I think was with somebody with BPD. So here's the way, I'll put it over here, that goes. Person says, people with BPD have empathy. Well, it's interesting to just make that forthright statement like that. Okay, but people with BPD have empathy, but when they are triggered or splitting, well, they're splitting when they're, never mind. Okay, sorry for that. But when they're triggered or splitting, they don't have empathy for the person they are splitting. Okay, so a couple things with that sentence and that assertion. Number one, I would say, do all people with BPD have empathy? Not really. I mean, it depends. And lots of people with BPD do have empathy that gets suspended and absolutely disappears when they are emotionally dysregulated and in a devaluation split. And then, so people with BPD have empathy is too broad a statement because they're not all the same. But there's that capacity, but that can really be different with different people with BPD. It can be very different often between men with BPD and women with BPD and things of that nature. And so then the person here, the commenter said, so once they're splitting, or triggered, they don't have empathy for the person they're splitting. Well, that's too simplistic, because it's not just that they won't at that point have empathy for the person that they're, that they're splitting and devaluing. But if another person walks in the room, it's not like, you're going to be getting this certain attitude of devaluation and lack of empathy. And then they're going to turn to somebody else and go, oh, hi, or, and have empathy for them. Not at all. It's like if a borderline is raging and you're standing there and you have a child or two and one of your children comes into the room, the person with BPD is not going to then have empathy for the child or teen or whatever as they are devaluing you. That devaluation kind of like a cloud, just engulfs everyone. So it's not just one person. It's not like, they don't have any empathy for the person they're splitting. Because if anybody else is around, they don't have any empathy for anybody in the middle of a devaluation split. And all that defense, all the defense mechanisms contained within that. And the commenter says the best way to describe it, I don't agree with you that you're describing it the best way, but, hey, the best way to describe it is if you were running for your life, you would in that moment have time. In other words, probably in that moment have no time to have empathy for other people's feelings. Okay, but that's a more justifiable situation. That's something that may happen to people or for people, but it's not something that happens every day or often or happens based on nothing really happening in the here and now in an environment when a person with BPD is splitting to devaluation, emotionally dysregulated, triggered, and going to have entirely suspended empathy. So if you're running for your life, it's a little bit different. And then, and that was a question. Well, obviously, no. If you're running for your life, literally, that you're gonna have all your nervous system firing for fight, flight, which would be the flight part, and you're going to be totally focused on what you need to do to save your life in a real life and death situation. The problem with that is, and why it's a disorder, is that triggers might actually be quite innocuous. Triggers are never innocuous. people with BPD are triggered, or they start splitting to devaluation and feeling like they really need to defend themselves from a primal perspective. Often when things aren't that serious or could be innocuous, but the triggers themselves are not innocuous. Okay. What is felt by a borderline internally when they're triggered, even if nothing's happening in the immediate environment, like what's happening, what's happening inside of them is not innocuous at all. It is very emotionally dysregulating, often terrorizing, way too many feelings that they don't have awareness of where all the feelings are coming from, and they don't have an idea how to cope with them. So there's nothing innocuous about that. And you said and they are not actually running for their lives, but despite this, they feel like they have to put all energy into protecting themselves, even if that means manipulating and attacking others physically or emotionally to do so. Or simply, what's simple about this? Simply ghosting. And again, the person refers to, like a partner or a friend or who's ever with the borderline as the split person. It's not just happening, the splitting and the devaluation that you might have experienced, commenter, or many of you out there. It's not like you're just a split person. Like often it's wider, deeper, and much more complex why people with BPD get emotionally dysregulated, how, when. Not all of them are the same in terms of level of severity of that. What's actually going on inside them, which you can absolutely not know or understand. And the fact that you're not just a split person. When they're in a split, it's kind of like everything goes into that category. And by the way, when people with BPD, there's no innocuous triggers, not for what they experience inside. And you said they're not actually running for their lives. But despite this, they feel like they have to put all energy into protecting themselves. Well, yeah, they do. But there's no real connector, especially in an untreated borderline, between all they're overwhelmed with and feeling right now, even if nothing happened in the environment, because their triggers are internal. So whatever triggered them, it's like, it's individual to people how they'll get triggered, how severe it will be. And the bottom line is that it's not just they feel like they have to protect themselves. It's absolutely all and the only thing they know how to do. It's an unconscious repetition, compulsion, reenactment of trauma from childhood. They don't just they just feel like, and they have to do this. They have to protect themselves because there is no self there. And they're operating out of I guess the words that I should use to make it clear are a pathological false self that has kind of risen up at the time of the emotional arrested development, where the otherwise, burgeoning authentic self around the age of 2 or before was attempting to come into existence, was totally ruptured, and then this pathological false self protector rises up. Because when we talk about people with BPD and the false self and the defenses, etc., it's not everybody has a false self. So not everybody's false self does that. So it's a more pathological, more profound protector false self in people with BPD. And what do I take away from this comment that I think it should matter to many of you that you're not going to want to hear? So many of you think that you understand the person that you are with BPD or people with BPD so well, so intricately, all the way to the bottom of the complexity. And you don't. You just don't. And I think that's what I'm here trying to educate about. And then this person also, when he said, and that's why it's a disorder. No, there's many other reasons why it's a disorder in a collective nature of what makes it a disorder. not just this one thing that, I guess in a way you could say the commenter was sort of inferring that they act like they're running for their lives, but they're not running for their lives. And if you were really running for your life, which commenter, no offense, just shows how little you actually understand this. So not that you're entirely wrong, but you really oversimplify it. So anyway, when people with BPD who have the capacity for empathy are triggered, emotionally dysregulated, fearing abandonment, or in a situation of fearing engulfment, they're going to do a reenactment unconsciously and automatically of the repetition compulsion to reenact, like repeat what happened to them in childhood. And then you become, in a splitted evaluation, as I've said in so much content, the object other parent representation of the bad wounding parent or parents. And so with that, it's much more complicated than I think this commenter or many people realize. However, there's more than one type of empathy. People with BPD have the capacity for empathy. They are not all the same. And what I'm talking about here is untreated. So people with patterns of BPD, not even diagnosed. People diagnosed untreated with BPD. Of course, both those categories will be untreated. And then, so those people with BPD, they're all individuals. So their degree to which they have the capacity or the potentiality for empathy and how they will manifest or partly or maybe not manifest empathy at all to other, it varies greatly. So you can't just say people with BPD have empathy because it's the capacity or the potential, yes, but actual empathy, no. There are some people with BPD and just other, like aspects of the BPD that's more severe than some other people, if we're talking about all untreated BPDs here, which I am, that will really not have that much empathy at all. They really just, outside of the idealization phase, which is really not real, which is really not all about you like people think it is, it's about the object other parent representation that you represent. A good parent never had. And so even in idealization, people might think every person with BPD shows empathy, but I've talked to countless clients that explain to me that they never even got any idealization from a person with BPD. So don't think that there's a one size fits all, one statement fits all. And I'm quite aware that when I'm talking in my content, sharing in my content, trying to educate in my content, but who I'm really talking to out there are people that are with people who have patterns of BPD not diagnosed, people that are diagnosed and untreated, and even if they've seen a therapist here and there, they really haven't done enough work. So the bottom line is that not all people with BPD are the same. They're not all in the same place. Some people with BPD are far down the road getting close to recovery, or some people with BPD have recovered because they went to psychodynamic transference focused psychotherapy, and they did that for probably 8 to 16 years. And when that is committed to and people can stick with it, which is really hard for people with BPD to stick with it, and that's because they lack a self, and that's because that therapy is really, really daunting, takes a long time, is very scary and very painful. I think it's very worth it, but very scary and very painful. So this idea that all people with BPD have empathy, well, what are we talking about? Effective empathy or cognitive empathy? And I'm going to, like I said, do a podcast on that soon. And all people with BPD are not the same. And I've been getting a lot of messages, some of them with quite the language, like trolls from people with BPD, and some respectful messages from people with BPD, wherein they put forward what they believe, and they sometimes are very accurate. Some people with BPD can comment on this channel very accurately, and others are or are you still ground zero, trolling, angry, swearing, all that. And then there's people with BPD in between those two, like groups of people with BPD who, they might be a little rough around the edges, but they can still civilly give their opinion. And they often tend to not quite understand, maybe in a similar way as I don't think this person totally understands, or a lot of people don't, how complex this is. And of course, a lot of people with BPD will be saying, we have like even more empathy than healthier people, and etc. And it all just starts to get into the all black and white. So on the subject of BPD and empathy, I think it's really important to note that it's not the same for everybody, whether it's everybody untreated, whether it's, like the differences between people in treatment, people doing well in treatment, people getting nowhere in treatment, and people who absolutely refuse and look like they'll never go to treatment. And by the way, just a reminder, if you're with somebody with BPD and you're going through it and there's a lot of, emotional and verbal, if not other types of abuse going on, and they keep promising on Hoovers to go to therapy, and you can't invest in that, because if they're at ground zero, they're untreated, even okay, so yeah, it doesn't matter what age they are. You're not going to see change as quickly as your fantasy bond feelings and sort of otherworldly thoughts and false hope, etc., might indicate to you that you are. And but on the other side of all this, I'd like to say, and I'll mention in the podcast that I'm going to do on this specifically, on BPD empathy, or what's going on with it, and etc., even more deeply, because it's very complex, is that, well, again, it's really important to say all people with BPD aren't the same. And I think too many people, when you've experienced a person with BPD in a relationship, and maybe it's over now, or maybe you're still trying but it's not working, etc., and it's really painful, then people tend to think that what they experience with one person with BPD means they're all the same. We see this all over the echo chamber of YouTube, not just YouTube, the internet. And that's why I'm saying, no offense to this commenter, but like, it's what he said was too simplistic and too like not expanded enough, not understood to the complexity of the deepest level when it comes to borderline personality and what is it. And it's not just a disorder over this, black and white splitting, idealization to devaluation, and what's happening with empathy or not. That's not the only reason BPD is a disorder. So that was highly, highly just like incorrect. And that, yes, you need understanding for your healing process of what happened with that person with BPD, but not what all borderlines are like or what all borderlines do. And then, of course, people with codependency have to really start looking at yourself, or anybody who's been in a relationship with a person with BPD. You really have to start looking at yourself, because you have some responsibility in there, not for what the borderline did, etc., but for your own choices, and choices that often people don't realize they're making. And by the way, I think sometimes, quite understandably in a way, but we have to be careful. I have to be careful how I phrase this. A lot of times, people who are in relationships with people with BPD, who will get triggered, emotionally dysregulated, split to devaluation, if not like stay in that after a major split to devaluation, because there is no re-idealization after that. They might go back to a base mood. They might be able to find a shard piece of the niceness that isn't connected because they don't have a self, but it's never going to be the same after a major devaluation or split, whether it leads to a rupture in the relationship outright, like ghosting or discard, or not. I think it's really important to realize that people with codependency have way, way often, most people, again, not everybody's the same with codependency, you have like toxic empathy. You have like way too much empathy for borderlines often. And then what happens over time, and you getting hurt and not heard and not understood, and you can't have a logical conversation with a person with BPD, at least, again, most people untreated with BPD. People with codependency, sometimes what can lead to reactive abuse, besides your nervous system is inundated and it's just you can't function anymore the way that it did, and so you might have an outburst. And the thing is, this is also telling in a way, but people with codependency trying to communicate and make relationships work with people with BPD. We're always talking about, do borderlines have empathy or not? Fair enough. I'm going to go more deeply into it. But codependents can have compromised, triggered lack of empathy as well. And is that exactly like BPD? No, but it can happen. So I think you have to keep that in mind as well. And people who've been with borderlines, are you still trying to work it out? We really need to look at across the internet. Like, I mean, I'm just saying this, I can't do anything about it. But the people that continue to vilify people with BPD as if like you weren't even there and it all just happened to you, what they do, and they do traumatize and hurt you, that's not your responsibility, no. But when you stay there, let me make it clear, I've said this before, when you stay there, because, well, I think they have empathy, but I don't know if they have empathy, but I think she has empathy when she's not mad at me or splitting me, or what are you doing? Because you're making a choice. Once you know they have BPD or the patterns of BPD and they're not in treatment and you can't wait for that anyway, once you know all of this, well, I really empathically say to you, though, passionately, do you recognize the choice that you're making to continue to stay there, to continue to go through all this? At that point, even though what the borderline's doing is not okay, we don't justify it, we're not defending it, but at that point, is it really all just a borderline? No, because you're still there. And yes, there's trauma bonds, fantasy bonds, a betrayal bond. And yes, it's really hard to walk away. But people need to get help, and I'm out here to work with you if I resonate with you. But the bottom line is, don't just be vilifying them, because what are you doing when you stay, when you want them back, when you're working on getting hoovered and you're reverse hoovering, and you already now know what they do, what they're capable of, what they're not so good at necessarily, what won't happen very often compared to the devaluation and the suspended empathy. No matter if they're a person with BPD with lots of empathy or potential for empathy, you're not going to get so much empathy after a first major devaluation split, on and off relating, you hoovering, reverse hoovering them hoovering you, on and on, like this relationship recycling. At this point, you as a codependent, you're not responsible for the borderlines abuse and etc., but you are re-volunteering every time you go back to get the same thing. I guess in some fantasy bond place, please recognize that you think it's going to be different, because it isn't going to be different. These are cycles, and codependents are choosing to recycle the borderline cycles, if you get my drift. So, how much empathy, by the way, do we think that codependents have for people with BPD at the end of like 15 recycle tries in a relationship? But yeah, in the beginning and for the first few times, or the first, the main relationship part, people with BPD, like you can talk about whether borderlines have empathy or not. But again, how about you look into a little, focus on, work with someone to realize just how incredibly toxic your like seemingly never ending empathy is. So, on this question about BPD and empathy, it also brings people with codependency in to what's going on for you and where's your empathy at, because some codependents will withhold empathy, get really hurt, get really mad, but many codependents will just double down, triple down, quadruple down, 10 times down on, I'm gonna be like nicer, I'm gonna try harder, I want to keep this borderline from doing this split, which you can't control. And so, yeah, what about codependent empathy, which is usually like way too much and extremely like toxic levels of said, and you're losing yourself through that aspect of the question of empathy in these relationships or with people with BPD to a very significant degree that might not quite reach the level of what the borderline is doing. But remember, not all people with BPD, when they get overwhelmed, dysregulated, triggered, etc., and split to devaluation, which is an automatic negative protective thing that happens. They don't choose it. They're not actually choosing that. It's unconscious repetition compulsions, and it doesn't make it okay, and it's not an excuse for how they treat people. Hope that was helpful. Take care.